All right, this should work. Press the one in the chat if you're able to hear me right now. Press the one in the chat if you're. Excellent, you guys can hear me. There's a little bit of a delay, it seems, so we'll go ahead and get this started. First off, I definitely want to welcome everybody for one of the first live streams I've done in some time. To the individuals that have joined me in the dojo. Os. Today, if you've seen the title, we'll be discussing and reviewing the reveal of the nameless sword forms. I think these dynamics are a long time coming. You've probably seen me on other panels speaking about them and breaking them down in various contexts, but they are essentially the accumulation of a lot of understanding that we've acquired just in the space over a period of time. I've found that in general, we have been subjected to a war that uses non-physical means as a trajectory of attack. And by and large, it's been the non-physical vectors, specifically through rhetoric, that have been the most destructive and the most aggressive when it comes to issues and circumstances that pertain to us as a people. And I think that oftentimes the modalities of conversation that we're given are done in a very binary and in a very low resolution way that has us using things like axes to do the work of a scalpel. I think we've gotten very good at using that axe to do quite a few things, and we've even come up with a lot of ingenuity and created hatchets, very multifaceted tools to handle a wide range of situations. But what I think we could really service and make greater use of is the ability to narrow down and be more specific when we talk about certain aspects, when we get into certain things as they pertain to us. That's going to be the aim of what I'm calling a verbal martial art. It's what I'm submitting to the sphere so that you all may do with as you see fit. But its goal, again, is a self-defense modality, utilizing rhetoric as a tool so that we can narrow in and be much more specific on articulating what our needs are, and specifically being able to ward off hostile rhetoric that's aimed towards us. So I'll go ahead and give a couple acknowledgements in the chat before I really get started with the first form. Definitely want to shout out to Gold P. I see you out there, sir. Os, thank you for sharing. I'm listening. You've been showing up to a lot of panels I generally am on. I see you in the chat often. I appreciate you coming through. Mr. Blue Collar, I see you on IG, fam. Thanks for joining me. And I see Gyogami here. Yo, what's going on, family? Corey Wilson, man, it's good seeing you again, man. Let's see, Mike Carr. No introductions needed. Smitty, I see you as well. Glad you could make it. I see Anu219. It's been a while, man. Good to see you again. And we got the good brother T-O-T, yeah, the prophet of thought, TPOT. We've got T Riddler here as well. And Neil Ching. So before I get started, how many of you all in the chat are familiar with social dominance theory as it is understood? You can place a 1 if you're familiar with it, or you can just kind of leave it alone if you're not. Also, Kareen, welcome again. Thanks for joining. Okay. So there's a little bit of a familiarity with social dominance theory. That's good. That's good. This is going to constitute the essence of the first word kata. I emphasize social dominance theory because it is a direct rebuttal to a lot of the animating energy behind intersectional feminism, specifically as it pertains to what is understood as the so-called double jeopardy, or what we call in the space the double dip. It makes the presumption that due to an individual having a classification of non-white, we'll just say that in general, and having the genderization of being female, that there is a double trajectory of negativity that these individuals experience by virtue, again, of being non-white and female. And in the more recent dynamic, should they experience a measure of alphabetization, a triple jeopardy or a triple dip. What's important about social dominance theory is that it fundamentally recategorizes the way in which human beings understand their social structure. And it does this by placing it in three general hierarchical categories. The first one being age. And this is important because it spans out to not even just human beings, but this is observable in the natural world, specifically with the phylum that we belong to as Homo sapiens sapien. You know, the other great primates in general also operate with regards to this. And that's useful when you want to find other models on how this plays out. But specifically, you have the first organization being age. You do not have social structures within, we're going to, for the context of this duration right now, be speaking generally about human beings and as human beings form social hierarchies. The first rule of the social hierarchy is that age is the first dynamic that's put forward. In other words, you do not have children that run the society, regardless of the rhetoric or the hyperbole. You have grown adults that run human organizations. This is the first law of hierarchy. The second is, in general, societies are run under a patriarchal undertone, meaning the men are the ones that decide the rights and dissemination of rights as it pertains to the organization of any particular social structure, especially as it pertains to procreation. Generally speaking, you will have men organizing other groups of men that establish the society, and they determine the way and the context under which the women participate. This has been the general case across the board. It is very rare that you find exceptions, and it is only really in recent times where society has been able to afford not having to necessarily compete as overtly with other groups of men in the form of nation states, that they've been able to experience a different measure of this in the form of some egalitarianism, so to speak. And we'll get into that also when we get into sword form too. But specifically, as it pertains to the second aspect of social dominance theory, it is men who run the society in general and dictate to the women the rights under which they're able to exercise. This leaves us with the third rule, which is known as arbitrary set discrimination. And this right here is the bread and butter of where you're going to get a majority of your work from this sword form. It's very critical in recognizing that there is a gender dynamic within this arbitrary set, and it doesn't really care what the topic of discrimination is. It can be any modality. It could be a sports team. It could be a political party. It could be a religion. It could be a physical characteristic such as race. It could be a dynamic, a genetic dynamic that's tied to ethnicity. It could be tied to a language. As long as there is a group that can be identified as the in group and a group that can be identified as the non-in group or the out group, this dynamic will play a role. You will have arbitrary set discrimination. And what makes arbitrary set discrimination so interesting is that, in general, within this gender dynamic of in group and out group, it is by and large the males that participate within this dynamic that are, one, the most active in asserting this dynamic and being on the receiving end of this dynamic. Let's say that one more time. It is the men within the arbitrary set discrimination, be they in the in group or the out group, that are effectively the main players within this arbitrary set discrimination. By and large, the women play very, very passive roles within it, or the scale under which the women are affected by arbitrary set discrimination is much, much, much at a lower downgrade than the men who are in the position to assert power within that dynamic or are on the receiving end of that power on the outer scale. So here we are. We've got in-group men. Generally speaking, the in-group men will form the nucleus of the arbitrary set. And what you generally find is that in an effort to maintain control within their own in-group, their efforts are to maintain control over the in-group women that are within their vicinity. Oftentimes, it's because in order to maintain a measure of social order, due to the burden of reproduction being placed on the women have a different strategy to procreate by virtue of finding the, quote, best suited individual. And it's understood that this is where we get the formation of the in-group men dynamic, who in turn do what they can to, one, form the social ranking in the first place, so that they can then protect their in-group from other out-group men so that they can maintain a competitive advantage, lest they find themselves no longer in the dominant in-group selection. As a result, it gives rise to a phenomenon that's interesting within the arbitrary set group, which does not seem to occur on the same scale with the women, known as the subordinate male dynamic. Subordinate males are going to be your men that are in the out group. And what's important about them is they are going to be the recipients disproportionately of all dynamics that are considered violent, negative, or under the context of control. Being in this subordinate male group puts you at a scale to where when you look at stories of groups of people that are going out into the world to dominate and control, when you hear this word genocide, it's almost exclusively reserved for those men that are classified as the subordinate in the out group. And this is critical because you do not see women, even in the out group, that get selected almost exclusively in the same way that you see men being selected. And you can see this when you look at a lot of cognitive bias research that has been done going all the way back even to the Dahl test. But there are more recent tests you can take a look at which go off of the implicit association undertones. There's threat assessment studies. You see this a lot lately with police officers, where they'll go through certain training and certain physical characteristics will be identified as being hostile, even though they may not have demonstrated any sort of action. This is literally making reference to the in-group, out-group preference, where men that are within the in-group will identify characteristics of men in the out-group or the subordinate male group as being intrinsically threatening and violent. And there is a predisposition to immediately go straight to fight or flight and hinge on the fight dynamic. In other words, there's a measure of disproportionate force that is applied to those that are classified in the outgroup. And when they're presented with women, even if they're not within the same group, this dynamic is not experienced in the exact same context at all. And I think this is extremely interesting when we have conversations and we begin to look at the data as it pertains, for example, the common arguments that are presented by intersectional feminism. It would, in general, overestimate the damage that sexual violence causes and sexual assault, and fail to realize that in most instances, when we're talking about the application of power with regards to that, generally speaking, where there is a sexual assault on women, there's a murder when it comes down to the men that are involved. If you look in antiquity, even if you look at a lot more recent examples, in instances where women are assaulted, men are killed. I think one of the most recent illustrations of this I can think of, which mandated global attention and even a response from the administration at the time in the United States, that situation that happened in Niger, where that terrorist group, I believe it was Boko Haram, came in and those 300 girls were kidnapped. What you didn't hear about was the boys that were at that village that were outright killed and murdered simply because they had a Y chromosome. Not a word, not a nod. This plays directly into the dynamic of outgroup men. At the end of the day, we need to understand that when you are in that position of subordinate male, you are the disproportionate recipient of all aspects that are negative as it pertains to power. If you do not make an understanding of this undertone, you will fail to recognize the need to not only become your own in-group, but if your goal is the spirit of problem solving to try to address some of these issues, you're going to continue to be blindsided if you don't understand the mechanisms that are truly in play. It isn't that you're not working hard enough. It isn't that you're not trying hard enough. It isn't that a lot of these dynamics don't exist. They do. It's just that as a man, the moment you are in the out group, you are marked for dead. And I really need that to sink in, because that always has been the law of nature. And it's been the reason why men have had to band together and form coalitions to resist other groups of men doing this. This harkens back again to the whole reason why we have to really put a lot of weight on social dominance theory, and as it gives to an understanding of social dominance orientation, which is what it is we're ultimately talking about right now. Ultimately, what I plan on doing is doing some pre-recordeds where I go a bit more into a lot more aspects of each of these different forms. And I think that there is so much to talk about with social dominance order in and of itself that it could replace the conversation that we're used to having about racism in general and give us an opportunity to really fine-tune what these end results are. There's some really great literature we've already received from Dr. Frances Cress Welsing in the form of the ISIS papers, where she breaks down white genetic survival. Ultimately, this is nothing more at the end of the day than social dominance theory broken down in another context. It understands the fact that men are targeted because of their ability to assert sex, purely because one dude has the potential to impregnate countless women. And this being the baseline for the dissemination of power, and we understand how family structures form the basic building block for any nation. When you're getting into that arbitrary set discrimination, this is the core of it. This is the core of human behavior. It's just that now, instead of groups of men roaming in packs, staking out territory, what you've got are social dynamics done through proxy groups. You've got rhetoric that's played out politically. A lot of this control is done had a situation going on outside. I hope they're all right. A lot of these things being played out non-verbally in the form of rhetoric and indoctrination in the school systems, where you're effectively gaslighted into thinking that you pretty much are in the exact same position of all groups of men because you have a Y chromosome. And that just categorically is just not true. It's not. And it's not useful to think that you're on safe ground when in reality you're on deadly ground. It's not to downplay your status as an American. It's not to downplay your successes that you've made as an individual, but it's to understand the importance that this is what you're being charged for in the background, irrespective of what it is you've done as an individual. Ultimately speaking, this is the playing field that you are subject to. And if you wonder why there's so much hostility about where we are perceived to have needed to be at, or why we aren't where we should be, in quote, this is some of the dynamics you need to pay attention to. The arbitrary set discrimination and understanding the value in being your own in-group male. That needs to be one of the priorities that this space not only has, but a requirement if you're going to have any agency going on into the future, because that's being eroded with every invention as technology begins to outpace the speed at which the culture can really address, which is going to lead us to the second sword form. But before I move on to the next one, I'll go ahead and take a pause. If there's any questions at all about what I've talked about so far, if you want me to review something, or if there's something else you'd like for me to add, definitely say so in the chat. I'll hop into that, and I'll give a couple more acknowledgements since some more people have come in since then. Let's see. We got Bruce Leroy. Got the globe, fam. What's good? We have JBA. Salute to you, family. Thanks for coming up. Dwayne H is here. I see you, family. And then we got Jay Bones. Jay Bones. Good to see you, fam. Glad you can make it. Art Newstall, I appreciate the share. Black Uru Strikes is here. Kimo Sabe, fam. Snuggles is here. What's going on? And then Artisan. It's got a little bit more Scorpio in here, man. Appreciate you. Let's see. The Yongo Savage. Good to see you, man. I haven't seen that icon in a minute. I'm seeing a lot of BGS regulars in here, man. I appreciate that. Let's see. Jupiter Dev. I see you, family. Jay Gammon's here. Locked and loaded. Yeah, man. You finally caught me. And BGS. Os. Glad to see you here, fam. Let's see. So if there's no questions, I guess I'll go ahead and get started and hop on to the next sword form. So with sword form 1, once again, kind of in the spirit of the way they do it in Star Wars with Shicho. I mean, it's foundational, it's baseline. You can pick it up and go. It is an immediate rebuttal to the intersectional double dip argument. And I think that is extremely important towards problem solving. If you're going to have any form of foundation for you to stand on, so you can begin addressing a lot of the things you need as an individual that's part of the ADOS tribe, or you're here in the Western world group with us as a result. Very critical understanding and nuance needed. That brings us to step 2. And I can thank BGS for leading me down this road to ultimately creating Sword Form 2. The label is Environmental Mastery. And it's really kind of describing how the environment serves as a superposition of the civilization and the culture. And if you're not familiar with the idea of a superposition, it's borrowed from quantum physics, where it speaks to a state of matter that is in a suspended state of potential, where it is two things at the same time. And what ends up occurring is there is a collapse of the particle, depending on what it is you're seeking to observe. So particle wave theory helps break some of that down. When a particle is observed, it behaves like a regular particle. If the particle is not being observed, it behaves like a wave source or an energy source. If we want to simplify this, we can say that the particle has a positive or negative charge, depending on what it is, that's occurring at the time. And while it's in that state of not really knowing what it is, it's in a superposition. It's both at the same time. And it's interesting because environment kind of plays this interesting role where it is governed by various systems, but generally speaking, there are two things that will govern it. It's the civilization and the culture. And this environment can be realized and played out in 3 different modalities. Modality 1 is the natural environment, which is what we can all observe by going out into nature and seeing how the environment is in general. We know that due to changes that have occurred in the civilization, and technology is a component of that, that the natural environment has changed, even where you're at locally. Some of that could be influenced by the technology in the civilization. Some of it could be preserved by virtue of the culture, which is the other side of that. Some of it may just be part of the natural algorithm of how that plays out. But when it comes down to the human experience, we're back again to there is a way under which that natural environment is experienced. And this is part of that collapse we're talking about, where the natural environment plays a role. And depending on the level of your technology, the level of your civilization, it will affect you in a different way. And depending on your cultural dynamic, the way you respond to it will play out just as differently. And this is extremely important. And this is going to be a theme I'm going to keep going back and forth to. That's just the first aspect, the natural environment. The next is the physical environment. The physical environment is probably better described as the infrastructure, especially as it pertains to human beings. So when you go outside and you look at, well, you don't even have to go outside. You're in the physical infrastructure now. Your physical environment is your roadways, your sewage systems, the technology we're using to talk about right now. When we can recognize that within the physical environment, there's going to be differences depending on the state of the civilization and the culture under which is expressing it. We're back again to a completely different superposition. So in these times where we can be in a first, second, or third world country, you can see some varying differences in various physical infrastructures. It plays a role in the other aspects of the environment, as we'll see in a little bit, because we'll get into what manages environments, which is systems, and the main goal of those systems, which is equilibrium. But You've got your natural, as we said, and your physical, which is getting into your infrastructure as we understand it as it pertains to human beings. And we get into the third aspect of environment, which is probably the most relevant with regards to what our concerns are. And that's the social environment. And the social environment, again, ends up being the same superposition between where you have your civilization and your culture. And currently, right now, we're experiencing an extension of the social environment through the internet. When you use your social media devices, they are an extension of the social environment. But you can identify them in general as society. Society is probably the greatest expression of the social environment that we can describe, because one way or another, you are part of society. You are an aspect of it one way or another. It is a social environment. And the way that plays out will be predicated on the degree of your civilization, where you're at, and the culture which is animating it. And when we get into the importance of how all of these things interplay with each other, I think it's critical to recognize the relationship, how given that the goal behind these different systems is to maintain equilibrium, when there's a change in one of those two components animating it, i.e. the civilization or the culture, there's going to be an equivalent or a noticeable change one way or another, be it predictable or not, within the various environments. And even within the natural, the physical, and the social, each of them have a interconnection with each other. They don't exist in isolation, contrary to what a lot of people may think. Factors from one can and do influence the other. We may not really understand what those changes are going to be. And there are whole sciences that have emerged in trying to mitigate and study what's gone on with these environments as a result of cultural interference and dynamics that have played forth from the civilization. But this title is Environmental Mastery, because there needs to be an understanding of the relationship that the civilization has with the culture, and as we see now. Generally speaking, the culture serves as a means by which the needs of the people have typically been able to be met. And as time goes on, the way by which the culture can have those issues addressed is oftentimes done through civilization and as a result of civilizations. So you get interesting results where if you suddenly introduce a new technology to a completely different culture that isn't accustomed to using that technology, you may run into problems within their social environment, within their physical environment, the natural environment, or all of them. We can see a lot more of this take place when we observe phenomenons such as colonization. On the continent, we've got the example of firearms being introduced and how it completely changed the societies that ended up getting involved. As a result of this, we saw adjustments. Generally speaking, there's supposed to be a certain amount of time, or there has been a certain amount of time for cultures to come up with responses to these problems that emerge in the new environments that occur. But what we've seen ever since the onset of the Industrial Revolution is that the timing, the gap, the pause, the space between breaths from a change in the technology and the time under which the culture has to respond to it all has gotten shorter and shorter and shorter and shorter. And it's created an interesting situation where, as a result of having little to no time to adjust to all of these changes that have transpired with the technology and in turn the civilization, the environment has changed dramatically. We've seen it occur with advents of global warming in the natural environment. We've seen it occur with the overexpansion of certain infrastructure or various shortages that have occurred as a result. We saw some recent instances of that last year in Texas with the freeze over. You can also see it with the resource maldistribution in certain areas. But you also see it in the social environment. I think a really good illustration of that would be seeing the changes that the internet has inspired. Or we can just go to a not even that fast paced. Being able to outsource work to technology in the form of household duties by household appliances. Things such as this completely changed the family dynamic in the Industrial Revolution. And as a result, the dynamic of family and what you need family for already began to change, which had profound effects on the social environment within society. Every culture didn't have a response to that very readily. And what we find is that it's been the groups of people who have not had the more advanced technology that have actually been able to maintain their family dynamics at a more stable rate. That's not a coincidence. As you begin to move forward, and as the changes in the culture, or rather in the civilization, move forward, the less time the culture has to come up with an answer to this. And if you can't find a good response and instill that in the generation coming up, the end result is people are going to default to a previous setting. And what is that? To avoid pain and follow the path of least resistance. And then what do you have? People doing things that may be best for them at the time, but may not be best for them in the future. It's only under reclaiming and reorienting yourself with regards to your culture and your cultural values that you can begin to stave that off. And it's been the only groups of people who have maintained that continue to do well in these environments where the technology is outpacing the culture of everybody else, relatively speaking. I really want to bring forward the conversation of the idea of environmental mastery and getting into understanding the relationship between civilization and culture, because I believe that's where a majority of our foundational issues really begins at. Because in the Edo social complex, we're operating on a dynamic that places its values and has its values from a pre-industrial era where we were effectively manufactured. We were essentially pre-selected to function in a sterilized environment that overemphasized things that they're not practical for most other groups of people who had an opportunity to develop organically. And I think that's going to tie us into the next sword form and really addressing part of that downside to it all. And I'm bringing this up so that we can begin to have these tools to start unraveling the mess that our condition as the Edo social complex has really been handed to us as. If we can understand the vectors that first the social environment is organized by understanding social dominance order, then we can understand that the social environment is part of a superposition of the civilization and the culture in general. Then we can begin to ask the next question: well, what is culture and what is its goal? What should we be expecting from it, and how do we address our needs as individuals and as a group of people? And that takes us to what I call the demon gate, or that's one of the various gates. But we're dealing with Maslow's hierarchy of needs, and specifically those bottom four that are requirements for coping. And what happens when you are not given the things from your culture that permit you to cope, when you're not given things from your background, your environment that permits you to cope, what those downsides are. But before I move on to the third one, I'd like to ask again if there's any questions you guys have about what I said earlier, anything that you'd like for me to review and make a bit more clear. And while we do that, I can acknowledge a few more people that's come in. Yeah, Jay Gaiman. I think I mentioned him before. And then Ray Hanma. What's going on, family? And thanks for joining, Meech. I see you. Easy 2878. Larry Kirmu. Kirmu. You need to tell me how to pronounce that. Kirmu. Tall Ease joined us. Thank you for coming out, fam. And Sheed, we here. Big Duke, fam, what's good? Also see Fred Holiday over there. MLR, thanks for joining. Oh, when I say ADOS, I'm speaking about the American descendants of slaves, so that we're clear on that. Also referred to as foundational Black Americans. Individuals whose ancestors took part of the transatlantic slave trade in the United States of America. And I'll even extend it out for the context of this conversation in the Western Hemisphere in general. Queen's Virtue, shalom. Thanks for joining. Good to see you here from earlier. Roguish Sun. Os. Yeah, if you guys can, definitely hit the like button. I appreciate excuse me. Definitely appreciate any support you guys have. This is again the first one I've done in a minute, but I hope to do several more of these and really get into more topics such as this. There's certainly more forms in this. This is just the first three. I really want to get out there to really start the conversation. Deshaun, thanks for joining us. G, good to see you, fam. Glad you can make it. Yeah, I do need to do a video breaking down us. I think you guys probably caught me on the Roger Report when I broke that down before. But ultimately, it's dojo etiquette. It is a phrase. You can translate it several different ways. For some, it's push. Others, it's osuno seigon. It boils down to the idea of continuing to endure through struggle and adversity. It's a reminder that regardless of what's going on, that you still can, should, and need to press forward and press on. It's an encouragement. And it's a term that I greatly appreciate. And I think it's useful for the sphere for what we're doing. It's a reminder, it's a greeting and an encouragement simultaneously in one word. So I believe it's good for the dojo community. I think it's good for just recognizing the intrinsic humaneness that we all kind of share. It's just a reminder to keep on trying, keep on moving forward, keep on pushing. In a word, os. And shout out to the Roger Report for sharing the stream. Definitely appreciate that. Lindy, I'm glad you can make it, man. We always end up missing each other, man. I'm going to pull one small thing up. And we will continue. Lovelina, glad you can make it. Thanks for coming by. Industrialism. Okay. VJ says, pertaining to culture, what do you say about industrialism and Amish way of living? The Amish are interesting in that they found ways of adjusting over time. And that kind of brings up the point that we were saying earlier about how, generally speaking, most people, their culture is being outpaced by the civilization. But in the case of the Amish, what you found is they were outright just resistant towards a lot of these technological changes. But they've been engaging on it at a very cautious, very careful, very slow and controlled pace. And what you see is them engaging on it as they see fit. You'll sometimes see them in airports. Uh, some of them, while they're on official business, use technology. They're obviously using cars now. But the difference is, and I think it'd be interesting to take a look at their birth rates, because I wonder if there's going to be some similarity going on with them and other groups of people, especially with Jews, or the small hats, I should say. Um, it'd be interesting to see how their birth rate is looking and the way they continue that going into the future. But the theme generally has been, when they've had control over how they integrate the technology into their culture, they make sure that there's some sort of basis behind that. And again, the some people, or rather there is a theory which, I co-sign on, that the religion is playing an undertone. But my take on the religion is that if you want to understand a culture, generally speaking, the religion oftentimes is kind of a seed to that culture. Within the religion, you'll generally find the core values that a culture values in and of itself, at risk of being redundant. So I think that's kind of interesting to note. Um, but they've been very, very adamant about having a slow burn when it comes to the integration of technology. They haven't jumped headfirst into a lot of that stuff. And a lot of where they're at now is probably where everybody else was at in the early 2000s. And Lindy, we can definitely make that happen. You can hit me up on IG or my personal email. All my contact information should be in the description of the video. So definitely reach out, fam. AB Media, thanks for coming up. But I guess we'll go ahead and kick it off into the last sword form, which is going to be what I affectionately call the Demon Gate. I call it the Demon Gate because of a lot of the references esoterically made to dealing with swordsmanship and the energy that animates your intention. You've got concepts like the Demon's Gate or Hell's Gate, then the Heaven's Gate, and then the Abyssal Gate, each of which is one, fear animating the Hell Gate, love animating the Heaven's Gate, and indifference animating the Abyssal Gate. And the end result of what you get from the way an individual addresses their reality seems to differ depending on which of those energies is animating their disposition. If they're animated by a outlook that's predicated on fear, you get a lot of the behavior that is very common with scarcity. It's very common with isolation. It's common with not having aspects tied to things such as altruism. It puts you in a different value system because you differentiate yourself from others. And I want to deal with the dynamic of fear in reality and really tie this into the importance. Yes, that's where you get a lot of this term, these words, demon time, often. That's my subjective opinion. I don't think it's a coincidence. Generally speaking, of people not having their needs met. I'm pretty sure you guys are familiar with Abraham Maslow. If you're not, he's probably the most famous for helping to contribute to a new sphere of psychology known as positive psychology. He was not He was big at a time where Freud and Jung pretty much were the de facto authorities on psychology. And their main thing was to observe when people had abnormal things going on with them. What does a human being look like animated by the spirit of dysfunction? And what Maslow was attempting to do, which was a very traditional thing you see in a lot of other cultures, especially in the East, which is highlight what psychology looks like when nothing's wrong, when someone's actually in a positive dynamic, when they're animated by love rather than this feared undertone, this brokenness. And early in his career, he came up with the Maslow's motivational model, or the pyramid of needs. And it emphasized at first a lot of needing to get those baseline things done. But later on in his work, he managed to recognize concepts such as the peak experience. In other words, the things that occur in a human being's life that really make a life worth living. And I encourage people to really get into some of his later work before he died. I think it does the topic a bit more justice. But as it pertains to culture, and what I'm finding is that, before I found some of his work, we were coming to the same conclusion, that there's a direct relationship between those needs being met and what a culture does, and more specifically, how a culture shows people how to go about getting those needs met, which plays a profound deal in the way people may end up turning out in the long run. In other words, your culture has a personality. You can ascribe a culture to having a set of behavioral dynamics that is no different than an individual human being. In fact, it's almost as if people within that social complex or cultural dynamic are a systematic portion of a collective unconscious that forms a entity, a person, if you will. And it has a history, it has traumas, and it bases what its value system is based on its past ability to actually have those needs met or failure to do so. And it's very interesting to see a lot of this play out with the Edo social complex as well, given our history. Again, the theme is understanding the demon gate and why the demon gate is so important, because the demon gate only manifests when manifested in the spirit of fear. In other words, you're not having those baseline needs met, and so you will seize those things that you need. We have a very popular axiom in the Edo social complex of I gotta get mine, so I'm gonna take yours. This is nothing more than the demon gate expressing itself at its base form. When we get into the pyramid, we'll start with those 4 bottom basic needs. First, physiological. You absolutely have to have a general source of food and water. If you don't have these things, it's difficult being human, let alone anything else. It's the largest portion of the baseline. It is the most required. When you're in a situation where you wonder where the orientation of violence and crime comes from, 9 times out of 10, that baseline need isn't being met. It is probably the leading cause for all violence we know of in the modern social environment. Period. And I think that's very important because every culture has a different way of acquiring it and addressing it, and it has a different relationship with the way it procures its food and water and the relative value of it. Case in point, if you come from a Bedouin history or a history that's tied to the Middle East, you understand that their history is of being hunter gatherers and nomads places a completely different value on the way they look at food and the foods they even eat. You compare that to a group of people who have, for example, the Nords, folks that were in Slavic, the Slavic regions, or getting into Northern Europe. What are they called? I'm thinking Scandinavia. We'll just call them the Scandinavians. They have a completely different dynamic, a completely different system. Compare that to folks that live in the rainforest. The whole relationship that these groups of people have with acquiring that baseline need is going to be very different. We can pair that up immediately with safety needs. You need to have shelter. You've got to have a general structure that provides you protection from the elements in the world outside. In other words, from the natural environment. And back again, for every illustration I just gave, there's a different way under which people address these things. All of these things are embedded within the culture. Now, I'm going to take a pause with these baseline two things right here. And I want to make a point about the Edo social complex that I don't think gets made enough. If we understand that a group of people can have a shared collective experience and understand that as the social complex known as a culture, then a people's history is important to understanding the way they view the world. And we in the Eidos social complex have had 400 years in an artificial environment where every aspect was controlled. We have had 400 years where those two baseline things were outside of our immediate control. I can't name a single group of people on Earth or in history that's been recorded where that's been the case for so long. Not for that damn long. And it's crazy because they're already seeing epigenetic changes in groups of people who experience a single difference in a lot of those changes. Whenever there was a situation where one of those things were called into question, it left an epigenetic imprint on the genome, meaning there was changes in people's DNA when they recorded a single change to a group of people who experienced that dynamic. In other words, if the women were pregnant and they were going through a period of time where there was any question to the physiological needs or the safety needs, if they were challenged under any context, it left a mark, a epigenetic mark on those people that can be traced to this day. They are already finding epigenetic changes from people who experienced the ice storm back in 2011. 2011. They're already seeing epigenetic changes in people. 400 years of an institution of having no control over physiological needs and safety needs. I cannot imagine the epigenetic changes that have occurred in the Edo social complex as a group just off the strength of that, even if you don't change anything. I really want that to sink in. And that's just the surface. And epigenetics is going to be another sword form we get into in the future. I just wanted to make that as an aside to really bring the point home. But as it pertains to that institution, we need to understand that there is a set of values then that get superimposed on a group of people who have an overemphasis on those bottom two, the physiological needs and the safety needs, because we've had 400 years of not being in direct agency and direct control over that. That changes a culture. And as a result, the cultural value shifts to so overemphasize that dynamic that the other two, which are just as important, end up being thrown on the wayside. We see this idea oftentimes in parenting of, well, I've provided you with food and shelter, and therefore the parenting is complete. That could not be further from the truth. What you get are individuals that have certain needs that still aren't being met. Specifically, we get into the next one, which is extremely important, because this is where we begin the relationship dynamic. Belonging and love needs. Immediately after you have your physiological needs met, your safety needs met, you need to have not should, not could, need to have a sense of belonging and love. This is the baseline fundamental aspect of what it means to have a relationship. And I'm not necessarily talking about a romantic relationship. I mean, on a deep, true, fundamental level of what it means to be human. And too often, because there's such an overemphasis on the bottom two, physiological and safety, belonging, having that sense of belonging, optional, goes out the window. When I feel good about you, then yeah, I'll acknowledge you. Sense of love, yeah, I didn't hurt you, right? So there it is. Meanwhile, the psychological toll that's taken, not just on the culture, but on the individual subject to that, is so profound. What do we say? When your needs are not being met by the culture, you will utilize the demon gate and seize them for yourself. That plays itself out in two ways. One, a self-inflicted kind of harm, where you will believe yourself unworthy of that. And so you in turn destroy yourself. And people wonder why the self-esteem is complete trash for a lot of people. Or you see that being given to other people and you sabotage that and you attack that. If you can't have it, then nobody else will. I got to get mine, so I'm going to take yours. So even if it means being the bad guy, at least you have a place. And now your meaning of love, even if it's not being taken care of, maybe it's being abused and beaten, that becomes your imprint. That becomes the way under which you understand reality. That becomes the way in which you understand love. And that's how you get your needs met, utilizing the demon gate. There's a final one, esteem needs. And the two kind of play a role within each other. But I don't think you can care enough about the esteem of other people if your needs are barely being met physiologically, safety-wise, and you're busy destroying people or yourself to get a sense of belonging and love. Esteem is completely out the question. In fact, so much so that you have to siphon esteem from other people by taking other people's esteem down to get somewhere, or by completely devaluing yourself to the point where you don't believe you need esteem in the first place. If we look at so many of the psychological issues that are going on with the development of not just kids, but of the culture as we understand it now, it's almost from an exclusive just disregard of those latter four, or rather the latter two, that are just as critical. And I find that the Ado social complex is utterly and completely ill-equipped to deal with that at a baseline level. And it sees it as a higher function. It sees these things as a higher expression of function and not a requirement. Especially, and I'm going to put an underline in bold, especially amongst the men. If you are not having your needs addressed by the culture, you're going to find a way to seize it on your own. That is the entire purpose of nature. I got to get mine, so I'm going to take yours. And it's extremely unfortunate because this is probably the reason why we take to individualism on such a deep level that it works to our disadvantage. There's a phrase I used to say about us all the time back in the day. I said, our greatest strength serves as our greatest weakness because we're so damn strong that we don't need nobody. But we're so damn strong that we don't need nobody. Everybody else is working on some measure of cooperation and altruism because on a baseline level, the culture at least provides some of that for them. But for the Ado social complex, it only provides, you only get things provided for you if you meet certain definitions within the greater society and classified as being, or classification of being, American in general. And this is where we get a lot of the colorism issues. It's where we get a lot of our micro issues that stem and show up. We've got this stay in your lane culture, which I believe came from the plantation also. And I can break that down in another video too. We're just not encouraged to work with each other, especially as men. I think part of that goes back to the fact that it's weird. I think we see each other as our own out group rather than our own in group. Strange conversation. But ultimately, the takeaway is that the culture in general is responsible, or in general finds its responsibility in providing a means by which physiological safety, belonging, love, and esteem needs are met. And in the absence of the culture doing so, it falls on the individual to try to find a way to make it happen. And oftentimes, if they're found lacking because the society or the social environment they find themselves in doesn't deem them worthy of receiving those things, that person's forced to take it. And I think this is the situation that many people find themselves in more than they realize. There is, in other words, a personal dynamic tied to this demon gate, and there is a cultural undertone that's tied to that as well. I think if we have that understanding, we can begin the work of recognizing how we can get those needs met on a permanent level for ourselves, and then look at what needs to occur to the culture to start making adjustments. Or for some people, you may need to go to a completely different culture entirely. You may even find better results that way, which, sad and most unfortunately, that may be the answer for some people. But I think I'll go ahead and pause for right here with regards to sword form 3. Before I go forward, are there any questions you guys have so far about what I talked about with the third sword form? And I'll go ahead and make some acknowledgements to the newer folks that's come in. I think I saw you, Lovelina. McDrama Bear, what's good, fam? And Ado Art Design, thanks for showing up. I also see you there, Wordsmith. NYC Evolved 88, salute. Tiger, thanks for joining. Better late than never. You can always catch the playback, fam. And Lion 917, thanks for coming up. But I guess in a minute here, I'll go ahead and open up the panel for anybody that wants to come through before I close out. I know there's some other streams going on, but I think this was a good enough time to get this out there. And you guys can definitely expect some deeper breakdowns of each of these, and we'll get into some live examples or some other examples of these forms in action, dealing with certain social events that are going on currently, or whatever scenarios you guys are interested in. And don't hesitate. My mail's always open. You guys can toss me mail if you have a request. Just throw a little something on the Cash App if you can, and I'll definitely put something together. But let's see here. Let me get link. Jay Gammon asks, in reference to the Demon Gate, let me go ahead and show this. In reference to the Demon Gate, the implication is that the current state of our cultural dynamic is the end result of the generational trauma from the past 400 years. And I'm saying, yes, that is absolutely a contributor towards that factor, so much so that there may even be epigenetic remnants of this playing a baseline default, in other words, setting a general trajectory. The advantage of this being epigenetic, however, and I want to separate genetics from epigenetic, being that upbringing and environment play the role that epigenetics manifests from. So I'm not saying that it's changed the social complex's DNA. What I'm saying is that experience can have an overlay to affect the way that DNA is expressed. In other words, if the DNA is the script, epigenetics are the actors that play out the script. Let me get to the rest of your next question. Let's see. Okay. He goes on to say, and if that's the case, would more effort being put into providing these base level needs to the people be more of a worthwhile endeavor than trying to change the outward environment or culture? So here's why sword form 2 was very important, Jay Gammon. Because we understand that the environment is a superposition of the civilization and the culture. Meaning, in order to get a change of the environment, you're going to have to address the culture or the civilization, preferably both. But if you can't affect both, if you make a change in the culture, it will play out in the environment, ultimately, specifically the social environment. So what probably needs to happen is a few things. Those baseline needs need to be met, specifically those latter two need to be addressed by the culture. And there needs to be a reinstallment or a removal of fear and replace that with a compassion-based dynamic. And the only way you can do that is with trust. And unfortunately, we're at a state now where that's probably the hardest currency to come across within the social complex, specifically as it pertains to each other. You know, we just don't trust each other. And it's gonna take time to build that trust up again. But when you can point to somebody that looks like you and they're helping having your needs met, I think it's a lot easier to get that trust reestablished and garner it. And if there's enough people doing this on a baseline level, you can start the long process of reversing some of this, because it's not necessarily a death sentence, but it is a trajectory. And I think that's the big point that really needs to be emphasized here, that it's a trajectory. And if you don't change the trajectory, I mean, the end result's inevitable. I mean, when you look at the macro experience with a lot of these things, the way these things play out over time with millions of people, the pattern is evident. Those baseline needs simply are not being met by the culture. So I think part of the response is the number one, become aware of the need in the first place, which most people are not, unfortunately. But if they could be made aware of the need for it, then there could be a reevaluation of the values, at least in the spheres that you have influence over. And I think that's the most important key right there. I don't think people take enough time to value those last two values that are there. They make strong assumptions that those other two are placed forward so long as there's food and shelter. And there needs to be a less focus on what's considered baseline, because even the baseline provided by society now provides you with that food and shelter in general, in the form of assistance programs, etc. What's not given to you are those latter two. And people have to default largely by the family unit. But the family unit has become so overemphasized in the Industrial Revolution, ironically, specifically in the social complex, with that dynamic of focusing almost exclusively on just having the food and shelter, and nothing to address the self-esteem issue, the sense of belonging, the love, and the dynamic that's tied into having a relationship, so that that baseline altruism can be put in place. In other words, it is the glue of what gives you a community. Hopefully that kind of addressed what you were asking, fam. Oh, Locked and Loaded asked, what is a kata? Well, a kata is a set of saved movements or pre-practiced, pre-recorded movements in a martial art form that are taught generally to demonstrate the application of certain techniques. In Taekwondo, they're called forms. In other forms, they're designed specifically to go over set movements and teach principles. You can practice them while you're by yourself. You can utilize them with partners, but they're just a set of movements that specifically pertains to an idea or a scenario in combat. So the idea behind the verbal martial art or the various forms or word kata is to emulate that. It could be that as well, David. Dave Dow. Let's see. Gotta check this one moment. Kenneth Brown. Oh, sorry, I didn't mean to. Yeah, let me stop that. I don't think they're in the chat, so that's fine. But KB, shout out to you for the cash up. I appreciate that. And Jupiter, I appreciate that, man. I just try to relay this as clear as I can from the best of my understanding, man. This information again is for you guys to use as you see fit. But in just a moment, I'll go ahead and drop the link so you guys can come up and we can chop it up. Give me just a moment for the link. Let's see. Copy. Cool. All right, links in the chat if you guys want to come up and talk about what we went over, or if you had any other kind of questions tied to this. Hey, no problem, Jay Gaming. Man, I got you. Well, Snuggles, to answer your first question, my purpose for being on YouTube, generally speaking, I saw two major areas that I think don't get talked enough about in the red pill spaces in particular. The first one being how people can deal with the red pill rage. I don't think that's respected enough. I think people kind of just look at it like, all right, well, I went through it, so it's not a problem. Like, who cares, right? And on one end, I get that, but I don't think people demonstrate enough compassion for folks that don't know how to live if their purpose has been completely just hijacked and removed like that. Like, how do you come up with an answer like that? People need, if you're going to have something taken away, you've got to replace it with something. And from my perspective, I think there's a lot of good information that can be used to help you reforge or realize who you actually are. I don't think we've spent enough time in the modern world with ourselves figuring that question out enough. But for certain, I don't think we do that enough with individuals that are experiencing the red pill rage. So I wanted to fill that gap to really help folks figure out who they are to deal with that transition period. The other thing that I noticed is that people are entering into the black pill entirely too soon, entirely too early, entirely too, what's the word I'm looking for? There's a kind of an overzealousness with regards to getting into the black pill. It's not something that you want to aspire for. The black pill is kind of like that white belt that you get at first, and you train so long that ultimately that white belt that you have turns brown, and then eventually it turns black. That's kind of it's kind of the goal behind the acquisition of wisdom. Because if you have this wisdom and you don't pair it off with compassion, what ends up happening is you become indifferent. And that indifference really just leads you to a path that's so unfulfilled for a lot of people that they end up just painting everything black. So black that they miss really good opportunities because they haven't allowed themselves to be. They haven't taken the time to not just accept things for what they are and then dismiss it, but to not just accept things for what they are, but see your place in relationship to it. And then your place in that bigger picture. Then being able to appreciate that. Then plant that seed and then watch that seed actually grow into something that affects other things. Like, I think that is a very critical aspect to being human, to where you can see something for what it is, but because you're not animated in the spirit of trying to superimpose a meaning behind it, or animated by the spirit of trying to remove meaning from everything because you can boil everything down to a lowest common denominator, I think you cheat yourself out of life by using that oversimplification. And I think that's one of the unintended consequences of prematurely entering into the black pill. And so I want my content to kind of help people who are struggling on both of those ends and dealing with the truth as they receive it now, and preventing themselves from sinking into the quagmire of nihilism when they have really come to see patterns of reality for what they really are, so that they can forge their own meaning with regards to that. I know that was pretty roundabout, Snuggles, but you know, that's that in a nutshell is why I'm here on YouTube, to help serve folks in that context. And as far as emotional, I guess my perspective on emotion is a bit different. I think, and I got a video on this when I talked about the abyss. I think emotions are what make us human. You know, I think being emotional should be separated from being consumed by emotion. You know, I think that, and this is somebody who's an INFJ. My chart is saturated with water. I'm probably 99% emotion, 1% intellect, if I'm honest with you. But there's a difference. Like, you can have your emotion, observe it, and when you treat it like the weather, and it becomes a phenomenon that you can recognize comes and goes, so long as you're not consumed by it, I think it's fine. And I think it's extremely important to have that emotion. And I think there's a problem when there's a lack of emotion, because it oversimplifies things in a way that can be problematic, because there's a time and place for low resolution images. But if all you're left with is low resolution images when you need to make precise movements, you miss the nuance of things, you miss the interconnectivity of things, and you miss the opportunity to learn things from a completely different degree, especially since human beings are already calibrated to be emotional in the first place. You know, we can determine things like fluctuation in sound. We can recognize facial recognition. So I was just reading the next thing you were saying. But let me get to you said 3. I'll get to that previous one. And what are things that really interest me? In a nutshell, learning. About anything that I possibly can. Every day is a new day for me to learn something new, even if it's something I think I know or think I know something about. People teach me new things about what I thought I knew every day. And I think that's the profound benefit of having networks like this, man. Like, you've got so many different people who can look at the same thing, and because we're all different, we can all walk away with something different, and as a result we learn a greater degree of understanding of what it is we're looking at, which in turn may help me understand something else prior to that baffled me, you know. Personal interest, I think I talk about these things a lot. I'm obviously into martial arts. I do the vegan thing. I cover a lot of that stuff on my Instagram page. I do 1 meal a day, intermittent fasting. I'm big on fitness. I'm a minimalist. I do gaming on the side. I do fictional writing. I also speak Japanese, a poquito español también, and I'm trying to learn a little Mandarin, but that's going to have to take a back seat. We'll see. Let's see, in your last statement. Okay, well, I mean, if I sound like a robot, I sound like a robot. 私はロボットです。My relationship with Japanese really was just more a matter of coincidence, and it just had to come with the territory. Primarily because at the end of the day, I got into Togakureryu ninjutsu at the age of 15. And in order to really understand that, I had to get into the culture. There's so many cultural references within ninjutsu that it would have been impossible really for me to really get a good experience and train at the level that I wanted to train at without having to learn the culture, which means I had to learn Japanese. So it isn't even so much that I was on some, this is interesting and intriguing. It's okay, I'm not going to understand what the hell this technique talking about Tengu is if I have no idea what a Tengu even is supposed to represent, or the undertones behind it. Come to find out, this technique is tied to noses, So you would know that if you didn't understand the cultural significance behind Tengu having a sense of arrogance, and the big nose being a sign of arrogance and also being doubled over as a Tengu. So like there's all these little folklore memes that's built into ninjutsu everywhere. So learning the language was basically a requirement. Let's see, locked and loaded. Should take on astrology. You know what? And see, with things like astrology and human design, I buy into it. I don't treat it like a religion though. And I respect people who see it as, something fictional or non-useful. I'll meet people wherever, they're at with regards to that. Just personally, I find it as an interesting tool to help me understand myself and other people. Even if it isn't 100% accurate, it's still modeling human behavior, and it serves as an early model for human behavior. And it works for me because in ninjutsu, there's a dynamic understood as the Godai, or the 5 ways, and they're broken down by different elements. And these different, pretty much all the techniques in ninjutsu get classified as a particular element. And these elements have different ways they correspond and interact with each other. So certain emotions get tied to different elements, and your general response to a particular scenario would be a elemented or elemental codified response. And this is a lot like how aspects and the elemental principle that's within the astrology system plays out. I find it useful and it matches with my training. So I find astrology helpful personally. And it's a great conversation started with other folks that are hip to it. Let's see, Maxwell asked about Aikido. Aikido is interesting. I just kind of got into trying to find a school around here for it, man. I want to get into that a bit more. Their instructor, I think, was absolutely incredible. And Hasumi Sensei, the current grandmaster that is part of the Ryuha that I study with ninjutsu, he's really big on Aikido. Really, 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 really big on Aikido. And so, we've got a lot of familiarity with some of those techniques, but I appreciate the philosophy that he was creating with Aikido, before he passed on. But I think it's pretty hard to find a good school that really doubles down on the cultural aspect of Aikido rather than this whole, I'm just going to be ukume and allow myself to be thrown around all over the place like a rag doll. And then here you are getting in real life scenarios trying to defend yourself and you're getting messed up. Like, people kind of have to be careful with that. Oh yeah, I think it's an open secret. I'm a Scorpio sun and moon. I'm like a quadruple 8 times over Scorpio. It's crazy. No problem, fam. Got you, Maxo. Yeah, that Japanese occupation of Korea was interesting. That was an interesting history. There's a really good book that broke down some aspects of how that occupation went down. Called Taekwondo, a killing art. Definitely suggest folks get that if you get time on Amazon. It speaks from the perspective of some folks that went through that time period when Japan was occupying and the changes that happened to martial arts when that went down, and the reason why Taekwondo and Hapkido ended up manifesting the way they did. It's pretty interesting. But small aside, it's kind of funny because the Okinawan karate that got transported over there isn't even really Japanese. It's Chinese technically. So they got they got a Japanese version of a Chinese martial art that got retrofitted into a Korean style of fight. It's hilarious. But let's see. Go ahead and do a few more questions and we'll go ahead and wind down for the evening. Would you consider Muay Thai? You know what? I consider Muay Thai absolutely required understanding, and it is my experience with Muay Thai that knocked me out for the very first time in my entire life while I was in the military. And ever since then, I went out of my way to learn everything I could about learning how to fight against people with Muay Thai and use it my damn self. So I 100% advocate for it. I don't know about trying to go professional though, because the drama they put their shins through, I don't know if that's great for you later on in your 40s, but I digress. You got some folks that are kicking down banana trees. It's crazy. But Muay Thai fundamentals, especially learning your 8 points, your elbows, knees, learn how to clinch, learn your round kicks, all of that stuff is incredible. Especially if you don't have a lot of prior experience with other systems. Start with Muay Thai and get into Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. Learn that ground game and learn to master your ranges. It's a very, very good fundamental. You can always weave in boxing, just traditional Western boxing with a lot of that stuff as well to give you some better hand and footwork to go along with it. But, Muay Thai is a pretty fundamental system, especially if you've got good teachers. Let's see, Snuggles asks, what are the personalities you've had a hard time having conversations with, but you would still challenge yourself to have one with them? You know, I grate against passive aggressive personalities that are at the time animated in a spirit of trolling, like a passive aggressive troll that uses hubris. I think that's probably the most difficult and grating undertone for me to engage with. Very difficult, because I don't waste time with passive aggressiveness. It seems petty to me. Like, if you got a problem, say it. Seems so much simpler. I don't know how people, well, I suppose I understand why. Some people enjoy the responses they get from people when they are passive aggressive, but the passive aggressiveness to me just sounds like, or looks like, a lack of power, or a lack of courage. And so it's hard for me to respect that. It's it's difficult, especially if it's animated in this troll spirit of why are you so serious, etc. It great. It's probably, I would rather have somebody yelling and screaming at the top of their lungs, because at least they're being forward about what they're saying. Yell and scream and be mad, I can address your tone, depending on what it is. It's words over the internet. But it's more difficult for me to understand and respect passive aggressiveness and refusing to be clear about what your issue is. I think that's probably the most challenging behavioral dynamic that I experienced with certain people. Let's see. And have I kicked the, no, I have not kicked the banana tree, but I've had kicked those disrespectfully hard pads over and over again. And I've had the bamboo stick that we would train with. Well, the soccer folks put me onto that. And, they try to desensitize my shins. And I said, never again. They can miss me with all of that. But ironically, I did it with my forearms, because prior to getting into Muay Thai, I was into Jeet Kune Do. And so the Pak Sao, Lap Sao from Wing Chun was used a lot, the grab hand and slap hand techniques and the trapping techniques. So my forearms they're here for it, but my legs are not. And I think that's about it. Oh yeah, yeah. I've got Scorpio all over my chart, fam. It's crazy. My whole chart has me looking like an entire Star Wars villain. I don't know what I was doing in the past life. But yeah, I guess we'll go ahead and wind down if there's no more questions about the sword forms. You guys can definitely expect a lot more coming from that. Hopefully this provided some useful things for you guys to take a step back and look at, and sort of review for the future and take with you as you go into other parts of the panels. And as we have these conversations and as more people come into the space to challenge it, you know this should help add a little bit more diversity to the way you can articulate your points, and I think those will be a bit useful for you. um like I said, you can always drop some suggestions in my email. I'm always open to talk about whatever. If you have any specific things you'd like for me to go over, I can definitely offer my perspective on it, or at least direct you to somebody that knows more than I do about that particular thing. But I definitely appreciate you guys spending your time with me here today. And let me run off a few more of these cash apps before I head out. Let's see. To Artisan, I see you, fam. I appreciate you. I don't know if you want me to say your government, but initials being J. Thank you for the cash app. Let's see. I think that's everybody. If I missed you, let me know. I think it'll show it in my email. Let me double check. Yeah, it'll show in the email. Yeah, that's everybody. Frederick, I see you there too. I appreciate you, fam. Yeah, I think that's everyone. I got my first bot. Thought we'd go a whole stream without one. Okay, I'll take this last question and we will call it a night. In all the martial arts you've tried, which one you think is a passive aggressive style if it had to be a personality? Snake style. Snake style. Yeah, snake style is absolutely the definition of passive aggressive. Snake style is interesting because you use the snake fist. It emphasizes the pressure point system in a similar way that the mantis style does, but it really tailors you to getting involved with eye contact and non-physical engagement with the enemy so that you can weave the fist in and hit a vital point, generally along the neck, along the arms, typically something that it shares a philosophy with Mantis. But the difference with Mantis and Snake is that Mantis will at least lock up with you. The idea with Mantis is to grab whatever you attack it with. And if you don't attack it, it attacks you with kicks and then comes in closer and slowly climbs up your meridian system. So if you punch, it'll lock the arm. Then it'll hit a point on the arm. Then it'll hit another point on the arm. And suddenly you can't use your arm to stop what's going for your neck. But with snake style, it's very different in that it has a similar undertone, but you'll be right in front of them and you'll throw the punch and they'll just weave at the last second out the way, and now they're just a little bit too close for you to try to avoid, and now this weird little snake fist is poking you somewhere that hurts for no damn reason. And it's passive aggressive. And you can compare that to, something like Tiger style or even any Southern fist style like Wing Chun. It goes at you very directly. You've got some aspects of ninjutsu that can be this way, but with ninjutsu, when you're talking about the martial arts aspect of it, you're speaking on taijutsu. And with taijutsu, there's a different elemental approach for each dynamic. So you would respond dynamically to whatever it is you're up against. So your goal is to mold to the weakness of the opponent you're fighting if you can perceive whatever preference they may have elementally. It depends. But as far as the actual style that its sole purpose is just be passive aggressive, snake style all day long. And you probably can pull up some videos on snake animal style, on YouTube, and you'll see what I'm talking about. It's hilarious. Yeah, locked and loaded, it does look cool, but it's absolutely frustrating fighting against that mess. It'll have you flip a table. It really will. But on that note, I guess I'm gonna go ahead and start winding down. Measly me came through the last second on the Cash App. I appreciate you, family. Thanks for coming through. Definitely catch the playback if you're showing up late. But I want to thank you guys for coming through. Um, like I said, this will be one of many for the future. And definitely leave some comments if you hear some things on the playback. If you guys listen to the playback and want to talk about this a bit more, I'd be more than happy to. But to you guys in the dojo and the chat, os, definitely enjoy the rest of your night. It's been the Nameless Protagonist.